Hi, everyone. For those watching at home, Daniel Rock is an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania at the Warren School in Operations, Information, and Decision. His research looks at the economics of artificial intelligence. As quoted on the university website, this is the types of occupations that are most exposed to machine learning, measuring the value of AI skill sets to employer firms, and adjusting productivity measurement to include investments in intangible assets. He's been featured in the New York Times, Harvard Business Review, and Sloan Management Review, just to list a couple notable publications. Thank you so much, Daniel, for joining us today. So let's kick it off right off. So you have an impressive career in academia. So maybe you want to explain to our viewers how you developed your interest in the economics of artificial intelligence, and maybe also how Wharton and Sloan impacted your career.
Sure. Well, so when I was a graduate student in my first year, we had a computer scientist who was working on building automated vehicles come and give a talk, and he said it would take about 40 years minimum for us to have fully self-driving cars on the road in all cities in the U.S. And this was, I think, 2013, and there were plenty of people in the room who thought it would be done in 5 years. So there's a big disagreement there. Mm-hmm. And my sense as a grad student was that really smart people can disagree about this kind of fundamental question of what's possible, then that's an interesting place to be doing work. And I thought it was super cool. The idea that a car could drive itself was just absolutely fascinating to me. So I figured I'll start trying this out and start trying to understand the economics of AI a bit, and kind of haven't looked back since. It's been a fun ride, and I don't think I'm off of it yet.
Yeah.
Probably won't be for a while. With respect to Wharton and Sloan, I mean, massive impact on my career and how I think about things. I was fortunate to take an introductory class with two professors who are now, one of them is emeritus, but the other is still in the department, but I consider them both, mentors and colleagues. And I just thought what they were teaching was fascinating. So, took a few years in industry and then came back, and my thesis advisor was the thesis advisor of one of them. So, and then I'm back in the department. So, it's very much a question of being influenced by, really deep thinkers around me and helping me think about how to put some structure on these larger problems and questions.
Yeah, that's really great. And I'm assuming maybe, that car automation thing maybe influenced your research into, productivity gaps and intangible assets. One quick thing I wanted to ask about, since, obviously recently we've had the explosion of AI with ChatGPT. It's all over media. It's a huge thing. I guess, first off, what recent works or research are you conducting that you might want to share? And also, just broadly, what is the literature in artificial intelligence telling us, and what direction are we headed?
Wow. Okay. So very big questions. What I've been working on recently, so there's a paper I released with some colleagues at OpenAI. It's called GPTs or GPTs. That is generative pre-trained transformers, the technology underlying many of these large language models. That's the first GPT. And they are general purpose technologies, second GPT, which is to say that they're likely going to affect a lot of different aspects of the economy and transform much of what we do. So trying to predict where we're going to be in, 10, 20 years is very difficult because of that. Yeah. It's a little bit like a backbone technology that can change, much of what we do at work, much of the types of products that people can offer. It's almost like an entirely new type of software. So where are we going? I mean, it's a big question. Let's narrow that in a little bit. What do you have in mind in particular?
Yeah, sure. So I think since you're an economics professor, maybe you could talk a little bit about the economics of artificial intelligence, and a lot about what does this look like, I guess, for maybe the average American or the average worker around the globe.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, I think as Paul Krugman has said, in the long run, or productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's nearly everything. In terms of looking at how many outputs we can produce per unit of input in the economy, we're going to see, because of AI, I think we're going to see a boom in that. I think we have a potential to change healthcare and education and even housing, areas that have historically been very difficult to change with software. And there's sort of this revolution coming where we can use unstructured data, that is text and speech and images, video. We can use that, our existing analytics infrastructure and even new analytics infrastructure with data of that kind, and that's going to unlock a whole bunch of really interesting software applications. So I expect pretty major change from that, though not in a way. I think the press has often talked about how we're going to automate away half of the work and the economy, and I just don't see that happening. That's a domain of a much more powerful technology than the stuff we have. Though I do think many jobs are going to change in how they focus their time, and hopefully we'll get away from some drudgerous work and towards things that really deploy people for their best, what they're most excited to do, the things that are most enriching, and so on. But I tend to be pretty optimistic there. I think if you're going to be concerned, there's potential for inequality generation from these technologies. And the short answer is we don't quite know yet, but the longer term view, if this rhymes with earlier ways of technology, might be inequality enhancing. On the other hand, and I'm a two-handed economist, on the other hand, there's evidence that this may be equality promoting as a technology where you can use the best practices of top performing workers to help the least the worst performing workers to catch up, or new employees to catch up when they don't quite know how to talk to customers or something like that. There's a paper by Eric Cornelison, Lindsay Raymond, and Danielle Lee that looks at that, finds those kinds of facts.
Gotcha. So I guess in terms of things like automation, would you view AI as more as a positive tool for workers to, for instance, retrain themselves or to complement with artificial intelligence for, the upcoming week?
I think in most cases, those sorts of things that AI does is going to be complementary to humans. The automation applications, it's always easy to think of how you can use a machine to do what you're already doing. And there are applications for that with AI, and they're at least the last wave of AI. Nevertheless, the knee-jerk, defaulting to automation, I think, is probably premature.
Okay, gotcha. So we're going to transition to some more encode justice type questions. So it'll be a little bit more on, this balance between the productivity side, but also the human side. So some of the risks of artificial intelligence are pretty clear. For instance, generative AI, biased or racist data sets, and increased automation of jobs globally. Since you look at artificial intelligence more in a numerical and positive light, how do you often contend with these risks overall?
Well, I think sorry, I think there's some feedback or something. So I think the bias risks are definitely there. The answer we have to that can't be, I've tried nothing and I'm all out of ideas. Especially when the baseline is humans. And we know that humans have tremendous bias, and it's sort of difficult to audit what's inside somebody's head. So I think deployment of algorithms in certain cases where we can observe bias or we can measure it and possibly mitigate it, that's deeply important, and I think a new advance for us, or a new opportunity for us to mitigate systems that have generally had bias in them. Of course, I would encourage people to think about, not only baseline differences, say, across different types of groups in terms of outcomes, but what are the systematic causes of those differences, and are those things that we can do something about? To be concrete about it, I'm thinking of a paper by Anya Lambrecht and Catherine Tucker looking at Facebook advertising. They posted, STEM ads, and those ads got shown to men more often than women. Mm-hmm. So if you want to document a disparity, that's there. But they, pushed past that and said, why does this disparity exist? Mm-hmm. It turns out that women's eyeballs are more expensive. So that creates a different set of solutions, policy responses that you might consider in terms of trying to mitigate bias. And I think that's the sort of work we need lots more like that.
Yeah, great answer.
Just with respect to automation, I think we already covered that. I don't think we're facing a ton of automation in a super damaging way. But I am in a position recently where we're thinking more about policy responses for displaced workers, and I don't think we should care super deeply about why someone's displaced as much as whether they're displaced in the first place from work and whether they feel disconnected from the economy. So what I think we need to do actually is treat symptoms here. And whenever a worker is down on their luck, we shouldn't be asking why are you down on your luck. We should be thinking about how to get them back on their feet.
Gotcha. Okay, so a lot of retraining, things like that. I guess also I want to just quickly ask you about generative AI. Since if we can reach a level where AI is smarter or like equivalent to humans, that could have huge impacts on the economy. Do you see that as a risk, or is that more maybe like a positive for society?
Yeah, generative AI is interesting. I think we've made much of being able to create. I mean, it is absolutely remarkable. So we've made much of being able to generate text and images and sounds, whatever it happens to be. It's a totally new type of software to be able to do that, and that's the set of models that actually outputs like numerical representations of this content to things that are interpretable or understandable for us. That's called a decoder model. Where I think there's a ton of opportunity as well as in the encoder model, taking those unstructured data sources and representing them numerically, and then allowing computers to do operations on those. Like, there's going to be all sorts of really interesting stuff that we build off of what's called, effectively a lossy compression. You lose some information, but you kind of get to the core of what that document or that sound file, whatever it happens to be, core of the information there. So I'm very excited about generative AI, particularly in the biotech space, the material space. I think the interaction of atoms and bits there is going to be really fruitful. We should see long-term productivity gains, but also just massive quality of life improvements.
Okay, solid. I also wanted to quickly touch upon, I guess, how major companies or even governments should approach these issues. Maybe more in terms of automation or some of the more systematic risks. Do you have any suggestions for how these actors should interact with AI and their implementation?
Yeah, I think now's the time to start trying that stuff. Let's see, from the corporate perspective, the line now. I think this is Erica Nelson and Andy McAfee who might have been the first to put it out there, but plenty of people have said this. You're not going to, it's not that AI is going to be managers, for example. It's that managers using AI are going to be managers who don't. And I think there's a lesson there for companies in general. Like, if you're not using AI and machine learning, I think you have to ask yourself why you aren't. So with generative AI or the latest wave, it's time to start testing out some use cases, maybe some point solutions and some specific tasks where it can augment folks, but also starting to think about where the commonalities across your organization, where you can deploy a systematic solution that reconfigures how you do work in the first place. So that's where, by the way, most of the churn happens with these employment questions. It's the entire system. A new system is created, and that new system has got different demands. So you fire a third of the staff from the old system and hire another 2/3 or something with a different mixture. That's where a lot of that displacement can happen. It's because you're just not doing things the same way you used to be doing. So that's I think it's time for companies to start thinking about that carefully. And I know that many of the forward-thinking boards and CEOs out there are really pursuing that. Now, from the government's perspective, it is important to start thinking about what reasonable regulation might look like. I think right now, in many cases, the risk is that a bad set of policies is enacted. this is my personal perspective. I think a bad set of policies might sort of inhibit innovation too aggressively. But in many other cases, like our existing laws are more than capable of handling the problem. Like, for example,
Yeah.
we want laws that say don't discriminate on the basis of race and gender, right?
Yeah.
Not laws that say don't discriminate on the basis of race and gender using AI. So, thinking about making sure we get the outcomes we want is often, regulate for the outcomes you want, not necessarily the process to get there.
Okay, great. As Jeffrey Babin would say, the best decision you can make is making a decision. So you could just being proactive and just caring about AI. That's great. So I also wanted to ask you about one more issue with an AI. So there's the issue of the black box where humans can't really understand how the AI thinks and how it got there. How much of a concern do you think this is within, I guess, productivity or any of these other risks that we talked about and how we try to understand AI?
Yeah, the interpretability. So this is called the interpretability for models, and that's one of the things you trade off to using a deep learning model instead of wherever you could, I guess, linear regression or something like that. So there's a ton of research going on in that space. People are building really interesting techniques. Some of the classic ones are like Lime and Chat. There's algorithms you can run to try to get a little closer to interpretability and open up that black box. I think we'll see a lot more there, so I'm optimistic. But nevertheless, in the end, whenever you're embedding one of these models inside of a system, you have to make people responsible for the outcomes. It's not enough to rely on the algorithm. It's something like, I don't know, the weather, right? Like there's certain types of problems where if I told you it's going to rain tomorrow, that's enough. You don't need to know why it's going to rain tomorrow. You just need to know that it's going to rain, so you're going to take out your umbrella. So there's many questions like that form where prediction is like all we need to do, or generation is all we need to do, and then you're done. But for questions where we care about cause and effects, interpretability is super important, or like why something might be going on. I'm always really impressed with the types of interpretability work people do. Like, my colleague John Hirsch and his co-author Selena Carter have done some really interesting work on that and how it changes the interpretation of the results, like whether people trust the system or not when they see interpretability. So, I think that's we're in the early innings of all this stuff, and we're going to have to see a lot more innovation from interpreting these models as well.
Okay. Could you maybe, I guess, explain to the viewers maybe scenarios where cause and effect would be more important outside of, I guess, credibility? Maybe like you want to segment those types of, like getting just the result versus trying to understand how the AI is thinking.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, like in most of economics, when we do empirical work, we are concerned with cause and effect. So I want to know what the effect of a policy was. A classic example, right? Like if we raise the minimum wage, does it cause unemployment? And people pursue various clever designs to figure that out. The best of those is to run an experiment. So, like when this shows up in lots of contexts. So during COVID, right? We want to figure out, do the vaccines work?
Yeah.
You want to know, and this is a hard thing to do, if I randomly allocated vaccines to some people and placebos to others, maybe you can't do that. But in an ideal world where there's, ability to, ethically distribute vaccines to some and not others at random, ideal being like we can actually pick up the effects, not necessarily ideal from a social policy perspective, but I give the vaccine to some people, I don't give to others. The people who got the vaccine, they always do better, or they do better with some noise. Like that's a cause and effect question. Does the vaccine prevent COVID? And we want like very clear answers there. Whereas for predictive things, I might take a bunch of, let's take serving ads, for example. I might take a bunch of digital trace data about what you've been doing online and then use it to predict that you want to buy a product or something like that. So I start serving you ad things. And I might not necessarily care. there are versions of that question where, like, if I show you, I know that the website you visited would cause you to buy a bike with some probability, but I also might not care, and I just want to predict whether you buy a bike with that. It's cheaper for me to just serve ads that way. So, there's lots of places where it blurs over. You care about causes, you care about effects, or you just care about predicting the answer. Another one is like if I'm trying to trade stocks or something. Right? Like if I could predict that the stock is going up tomorrow, I don't necessarily care about why. I might just buy it. So,
yeah,
that's it.
Totally fair. I wanted to pivot the discussion a little bit more towards, I guess, this big picture of AI. So I read a recent article that talked about how China was much better at, for instance, getting that data because they used more of an authoritarian model. So their data collection could be quicker. It could be also more far-reaching. Certainly see this with like surveillance technology. Do you think that's an issue if the U.S. is trying to, compete almost in this soft war with artificial development and new technologies that are emerging, since we have a more, open model towards human rights and other things like that?
Yeah, I'm not totally sure. But it's a great question. So, I think the core advantage in trading some of these models that maybe Chinese companies may have is just that there's so many people in China. Mm-hmm. So if you start a consumer app, it's much easier to get the kind of critical mass you need to make some of these data science techniques viable, whether they're accurate. From the perspective of authoritarianism, I don't know a ton about this. This is more of a political question, though I will say, Martin Baraja and co-authors, I don't remember who was on this paper. So it's Baraja, Yang, and UPenn, I think. They've got some really interesting papers on AI firms in China about this data innovation and what the state might do. There's also, with this other co-author, there's Andrew Cao. They've written a paper about AI and democracy and exporting autocratic regimes, the surveillance state. So there are people doing really great work on that. I just don't know a ton about it myself.
Yeah, totally fine. Our viewers can look into that. I certainly will also. So I just want to quickly also talk about your research. So I know how you looked into something called the productivity paradox, and also other tangibles. I guess first off, why does this really matter in terms of like humans? Like, why do we care about this paradox? What does it mean for us? Maybe you could start off with that.
Right. So, there's some feedback. We care a lot about how much output we get per unit of input that we generate. In the long term, this is what drives economic growth. This is the thing that makes us better off. That makes it so that we have more opportunity to be happy in our lives and flourish. Don't feel impoverished and so on. So, like, if you go look back 40, 50 years, the quality of life improvements that we have now relative to them, a lot of that's because of productivity growth. So then it's really puzzling and disturbing when we see productivity growth slowing down for whatever reason, even though new technologies are being invented that seem like they could enable much better, outcomes. So, that affects us in a few different ways, one of which is just from an economic measurement perspective, which is, how policymakers make choices. They look at what economic measurements are out there. My work with my co-authors is to figure out, is there sort of a hidden improvement in productivity that we're not seeing? And we find that, yes, there is, but that means the slowdown is even worse. It used to be even better, and now it's slowed down more. So it creates another puzzle for us to try to figure out. Now, I think what that boils down to, where the way we characterize it, is that there's a bunch of intangible assets being created, and we don't measure this super well. So sometimes you use measurable, tangible stuff to create intangible stuff. And when you do that, it looks like you paid something to get nothing. because we haven't measured the intangible super well. That drags down productivity. Not for real, but it drags down measured productivity. Sometimes we get real stuff from those intangible assets that we built up. So it looks like we get something for nothing, and that's great from a measured productivity perspective. But really, earlier investments are paying off. And then on the other end, if we use measured things to create measured things, our infrastructure for measuring technological change handles that pretty well. Or if we use unmeasured things to create unmeasured things, then that's just missed entirely, so it's not affecting intent. So what we document is this kind of trade-off between in the early goings, you kind of use real things to build things that are real. It's not real, but use measurable things to create unmeasurable things. And that looks like productivity is slowing down, but then later on, you start getting something for those early investments, and it looks like productivity is going up. So there's sort of a cyclicality to it.
Okay, great. Yeah, so that's a good introduction. I guess when we're talking about your research, and also maybe like the implication of that, how do we, I guess, address that? Like, is there a model that you would recommend? Maybe some like discounting that we have to do. Like, how do we solve that issue in terms of like looking at the numbers and trying to get a better conclusion out of it?
Yeah, so we suggest one way, which is to look at stock market valuations. The market doesn't miss intangible assets because they still generate, profit. And, by adjusting for whatever stock market valuations there's, you can kind of get at that hidden intangible asset and recompute what the productivity should have been.
Yeah, totally fair. Okay. Another question kind of similar to this, but so there's something called the hype cycle of AI. Basically, where we are in this AI cycle of developments and implementation. I guess where do you think we are right now? In terms of just developing AI, implementing AI, and just reaching as many people as possible.
Yeah, it's still very, very early stage. There's a lot of change that's going to happen. I think if we stop building AI tools today and improving them, it'd still take 10 to 15 years for most of the benefits to work their way through the system. So this is going to be a long haul. I think the hype cycle in general, I think Ethan Mollick did some quick analysis. He's a colleague of mine here at Wharton in the management department, and he found that the hype cycle doesn't really exist for most things. That dynamic doesn't describe most technologies. So maybe it describes AI, I don't know, but there's a reasonable chance that AI just keeps going up and to the right instead of having some sort of like profit disillusionment. We'll see.
Oh wow, that is fascinating research. Yeah, I'll look into that as well. Sounds amazing. Okay, want to quickly shift focus to privacy again. So you have large language models like GPT-3 and 4. Just in general, LLMs use a lot of data. And some companies have even, banned LLMs because of this privacy issue. How do we contend, the amazing productivity growth we're going to get from GPTs and other LLM models with the privacy risks that do inevitably, happen or may occur?
Yeah, we should, these are decisions that way above my pay grade. But something to consider, be a little bit provocative here. I think many people, get mad at Facebook for privacy violations, but then they want to use antitrust tools to handle that. But that's a different question. That's about competition. That's not about it's not about privacy. So in some sense, having fewer firms is better for privacy, but it's worse for monopoly kinds of concerns. So we have a trade-off potentially between how many firms there are competing in the market and how well off consumers are from a pricing and availability perspective, and how private our data is. It's a set of decisions that we're going to have to make as a country or community, and we've seen some early regulations in Europe.
Yep.
I think shifting more towards privacy protection at the cost of having a vibrant startup, in competition environment in some cases. So, I have preferences in that space, but far be it from me to state those preferences here.
Okay.
What I think they it should be.
Yeah, fair enough.
I'm just one guy in that from that perspective.
Totally valid. So we only have 8 minutes left, so I'll ask like two final questions that are a little more in summary of everything. So I want to take this from the perspective of maybe, a low skill or middle skill worker. If you were in their shoes, how should they prepare for the one of AI? Maybe you can touch upon how it helped them, but also I guess, just in terms of their daily lives, what can they expect in the next maybe 5-10 years?
Yeah, well, it depends. Everybody's got different sets of skills, right? And some are more exposed, some of them are less exposed to AI. I think the advice for each one of those groups, depending on who you are, for example, if you're like an electrician or a plumber, it's a highly skilled job in the trades, and they're not super exposed. But like a doctor or lawyer, that's a highly skilled job in knowledge work, as people put it. That's something that is highly exposed, and those people are going to change. They're going to change their workflows quite a lot in response to AI. So I think the overall advice, if there is some to do, it's like be nimble, be ready to learn how to do things differently, and then pay attention. In some cases to adjacent careers, because there may be good opportunities to switch careers and deploy what you know, and you get paid a lot more.
Okay, very solid. And then last question. Do you have, I guess, one final message to anyone that's viewing at home? It could be about anything. It could be about life, AI, UPenn, Wharton, academia, whatever you want.
Final message. I don't know. I'd say, let's be excited about where these technologies can go and mindful of the possible downsides. But, I think I'm less worried about the massive or the existential risks of AI and more worried about, potentially bad people doing things with AI. So from the risk perspective, I think we should be fairly targeted in trying to avoid bad outcomes. And then otherwise, I think this is a fantastic technology that we should put a lot of effort into understanding better. And the best way to do that is to try using it to solve some of our problems.
Yeah, totally. Okay. Well, that's, I guess, the end of the interview portion. So thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, we'll put it on YouTube. We'll do some stuff with it. But yeah, thank you so much.